Okay, this is actually a retake. Not that it matters for the one or two people that listens to this, but I felt like I could do this a little bit more logically, and possibly succinctly. So the fundamental idea I'm talking about here is that the fear of death is at the root of all anxiety, and to do this, I need to talk about a few things. I need to talk about sort of two main prerogatives of the mind: control and projection. And then I need to talk about what anxiety is, which, yeah. And so I think the way to start, though, is to discuss. So the reason that I say this is, as I've discussed in previous videos, if you project, consciousness is about building a concept of oneself. And if you project enough times into the future about yourself, you inevitably get to a point where you don't exist. And this, I think, is a very crucial trigger for the mind, because I think from an evolutionary from the standpoint of evolution, from an evolutionary standpoint, words are difficult, I'm sorry, then it makes sense that the consciousness was developed to allow us to plan accordingly to avoid that point, to progress our life by coming up with scenarios where we might die and then trying to avoid those scenarios by planning. But eventually your mind is smart enough to know that there will eventually come a time. And I think that, on some level, everybody that is aware enough, that's projecting into the future enough, is going to be thinking about this. And that's why when I talk about insomniac fiends and sleeping machines in the previous videos, which meaning those are just sort of the end spectrums that I've decided to label consciousness as, you either are a sleeping machine entirely within the present, or you're an insomniac fiend residing almost too much, pathologically so, in your projections in your mind outside of the present. If you're doing that so much, you're going to be constantly battling this question of, well, what happens at this point? And this is where I guess it helps to then say, what is anxiety? And so anxiety is a fear response. It's triggering, the limbic system, specifically the amygdala, and I mean, there are cortical pathways. I think the anterior cingulate cortex is important, the rostral and dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, and the insula, or the insular cortex, is important for this. But there's some debate about this still, especially with respect to where memory for fear is stored. There's debate about where memory generally is stored, but it is pretty well accepted that the amygdala is the primary site that's sort of controlling the fear response, and not just the emotional response, but the physiologic response. So, getting the increased heartbeat and sweating and whatnot. And so this is kind of the point, is that regardless of what the stimulus that's triggering anxiety is, whether it's a test or whatever, the physiologic response, if great enough, is going to be triggering the same pathways of, it's going to be cortisol, right? Among others. But yeah, we'll just focus on that. You're going to get a cortisol spike of some kind, which is why, after, it's very interesting. Yeah, well, this is a whole tangent, but, it's interesting. I used to have a friend in college who, and myself included too, it's like you'd be studying for exams and then you'd get sick right after. And I think it has to do with this sort of reason, because you have all this cortisol running through your system, and then after it, your stress responses die down, and then your immune system, it's dampening the immune response to some degree, as steroids do. And then, anyway, I won't. It's a whole tangent, but the crux is he would always get sick after finals because now your inflammatory response is sort of going haywire, And so, okay, that's conjecture, I should say. I mean, it's you can read up on. I mean, it's pretty well established that steroids like prednisone, for instance, which is a synthetic steroid, they're dampen the immune response. But anyway, okay. Getting back on track, though, the point is that the physiologic response of fear is going to be the same regardless of what the trigger is, whether it's a test or a big cat in the jungle. And so that's getting at this next point, is that the very sort of evolutionary, if fundamental, whatever word you want to use, a state of nature reason for consciousness, as I take it, and as it seems evolutionary biologists take it, or maybe I should say evolutionary cognitive psychologists view consciousness as occurring to exert a survival benefit to the thing that's thinking, and it does this by planning so that you get this fear response triggered, and then you do something about that fear response. And so there's this two-part thing, is that you have this planning capability, and then you have this control capability. And I'll talk about the control capability in more detail, I think, at another video, but very, very simply, I think you can actually look at the consciousness as being largely about control, in addition to this projection and planning property, based off of just the anatomic. I've been trying to think of what's the easiest way to discuss this briefly, but basically the brain, if you want to think of it, is intercepting this thing called the reflex arc, because the most simple neuronal response is just an afferent neuron and an efferent neuron. An afferent neuron taking in a stimulation and an efferent neuron pushing it out and doing something about it. But then the brain comes in and it intercepts this arc, and it is able to modulate it. And so this is where I'm getting at, is like the brain can modulate the peripheral nervous system to do things. And I'll go into that in more detail. But if you want to read about it, just read about simple reflex arcs like the patellar tendon reflex, which is just an afferent neuron, receives the input of the mechanical stimulation of the hammer, then is brought in to the central nervous system, but it synapses directly on an efferent neuron that then takes the information out and synapses on the muscle to do the contraction and in some cases relaxation that needs to occur. But the brain is then also sending projections down from the cortex and whatnot, and it's synapsing in a similar region and is able to exert a degree of control. And this is seen through things like upper motor neuron disorders, where if you have a lesion, let's say in the motor cortex, at the region that is controlling the patellar muscles, so muscles of the leg and calf, or lower leg, then you will get a hyper-reflexive response, and that's sort of getting at this idea that there is a dampening that the cortex and supraspinal regions are exerting upon reflexes, because when you take them away, you get a quicker and more and stronger response. Whereas if you had a lower motor neuron lesion, such as in the efferent end, that's synapsing on the muscle, or the afferent end that's taking in the initial stimulation from the hammer, you would get a weaker response. And so that's very simple idea of how I trying to build a neuroanatomical case for why the brain and I guess more specifically consciousness is exerting a control upon the body to intercept the reflexes and do the thing that it has just sort of planned to do, because that's the whole thing. So it's one thing to be able to just plan to avoid the tiger, but then you also want to be able to tell your body to do the thing to actually avoid the tiger. And what was the last thing I wanted to say on that? There was one other thing I wanted to say. This is very good practice for me, by the way. I don't know. Again, nobody's probably listening to this, but this is, yeah. Feel like I'm not a very good talker. So, trying to get better at it. People say the power is in the pen, but, you know, others might say it's in the mouth. I don't know. Maybe in today's, I don't know. Ooh. Today's crazy world where you can just record yourself and put yourself online, it might be more so in that. But, yeah. Rhetoric, right? Okay, we're getting a little crazy right now. I think that's what I wanted to say about that. So, getting back to it, so I've talked about the evolutionary necessity of, well, it's not a necessity, but the evolutionary benefit that consciousness exerts on the thing that's consciousness for planning to avoid some mortal crisis that is either happening in the future at some point. You know, it could be the immediate future or it could be the extended future. And so, and I've talked about that anxiety is this fear response, and that this fear response, so I'm building this circle. So the anxiety is this fear response. This fear response is triggered by some mortal conundrum, and the consciousness, the aware individual, is responding, is detecting that. Excuse me. I hope I didn't just have a mortal conundrum. Is detecting that and then doing something to try to dampen that. But the problem with mortality is that you can't really ever dampen the ultimate question. And that's sort of why that's where I'm getting at this idea that, like, the insomniac fiend and the hyper anxious individual, which I think sort of ultimately gets labeled in this society as depression. Again, this is not medical advice or anything. This is just how I look at it. But the hyper individual that's fixated on sort of the meaningless of life is constantly triggering this fear response about that question of when do I end, because there is no sort of definitive way to avoid it. It will come at some point, and if you reside too much in the projections, that some point can seem like any time, because that's, you know, time sort of gets very it's abstract, and it's incredibly abstract in the mind. Yeah, and then you know, I'm trying to think. So have I covered everything I need to cover? So the argument that I'm trying to lay out is that fear of death is the fundamental of all anxiety. And so, yeah, just to put sort of the ribbon on everything. So it can sound crazy to say that, you know, like, fear of death is at the base layer of, like, a fear of failing a test. And it's not to say that, you know, it's a direct connection, but it's the idea that the reason that this system exists is to avoid death. And we just essentially build abstractions upon reality to get ourselves away from that initial, you know, the very sort of fundamental thing that we're trying to avoid, which is death. But it doesn't mean that if you don't sort of deconstruct all of these physiological emotions that we have, you don't get to that basic existential question of death. And so, you know, and I think that's evidenced by the fact that the same physiological conditions are going to be triggered regardless of if it's a test that you're trying to avoid or if it's a tiger you're trying to avoid. It's sort of in our body's perspective, it's the same thing, but in our mind's perspective, it's just a different reality within our. Well, that sounds fun. It's a different abstraction within our mind, and you can think of This is where I'm getting maybe a little bit too metaphysical, but I think this makes sense. So there's another sort of idea I wanted to talk about of this hyper anxious state. I just feel like I'm not being super coherent. Am I being coherent? Am I being incoherent? Non-coherent? Discoherent? I don't know. Probably. If it's a question, then the answer is yes, right? Fear of death is the fundamental of all anxiety. Or should it be the fear of death response, the physiological response? But no, I think fear of death. And so maybe let's just break down this test scenario where it sounds funny to say, but I guess when I'm talking about your building projections, I'm talking about it in that you have layers to reality, and these layers of reality aren't necessarily evident to the forefront of your attention, which you can think of as like the tip of the spear of consciousness if you want. I mean, what else is consciousness but it's that singularity of attention that you're focusing on at any point, and that you can sort of focus on anything, whether it's the immediate present, anyway. So you're worried about a test, and because you think you're going to fail, and this is the thing, is the mind can build up these abstractions to a ridiculous point. And I don't say ridiculous to mean flippantly or like failing tests aren't a big deal, but obviously it's different than an immediate threat of a tiger. But yes, you can sort of, I think, to motivate yourself to do things, we use this fear response. And again, I think this fear response, I guess it really is just fundamentally getting to this idea that the fear response is in place in the state of nature to help us avoid death. But now in this crazy society that we live in, where we're not really immediately confronted with death all the time, we are still triggering them, the same responses, but we are doing it on a abstracted reality that is many layers away from actually dying. But that doesn't mean that you still don't get to the basic physiological trigger of cortisol being released. So, you can think, oh my goodness, I'm never going to pass this test. And if I don't pass the test, then, I'm going to flunk out, and then I'm going to, become homeless, and then I'm going to, die of starvation or something like that. And so, I think the most morbid mind can and often does take it to that extreme state, which is the double-edged spear about consciousness. And this is why I think it sort of helps to not completely reside on either end of the consciousness spectrum, but to be able to be aware of the spectrum and then navigate it accordingly, so that you're not always... Because I guess that is kind of the other sort of point I want to drive home here, is as you get closer to the insomniac fiend side of the consciousness spectrum, you're going to be focusing more and more on this avoid death phenomenon, but that really has no logical end because it will come at some point, and so you'll constantly be triggering this anxiety loop, and then as you trigger the loop, the pervasive, or there's a P word here that I wanted to use, but I can't think of it. Is pervasive the sort of bad and good thing about the way the mind works is that it works via association, as I've discussed. And so as you meditate on something, you will start incorporating other triggers, sensorial triggers into it. So if you're constantly thinking about death, for instance, or your mortality, and you're looking at something and you're always thinking about it and you're always looking at this specific red door, then that red door is going to start to be a trigger for that. And then, if you can, and this is where I think these sort of feedback loops of depression come into play, which I think is ultimately caused by existential dread, this meditating upon your mortality. So yeah, I think I've said all I should say. I was gonna hopefully do it in a more concise way, but it's been 20 minutes. But yeah, fear of death is the root of all anxiety, and kind of with everything in the mind, I think the way of mediating this is being aware of it. That's kind of one of the reasons I've been going through all this for myself, mostly. I mean, because again, nobody's going to watch this. This is just me and me. It'll just be between me and me. But yeah, and this is why like the placebo effect is a thing. This is this interesting phenomenon of the mind that we don't completely understand, but it's sort of one of the hopes with these videos is that I'll sort of get a better understanding of this therapeutic potential of the mind, or I should say therapeutic potential of awareness, because yeah, and then maybe very, very simply, the therapeutic potential of awareness is from this planning capability. If you're aware of a threat, then you can do something about it potentially, and I think the placebo effect is getting at, okay, well, now I'm getting into whole things, but placebo effect's interesting because it's, we have to get rid of it. We don't, but we have to mathematically analyze data or set up, double-blind research trials to correct for the placebo effect. And so, that's obviously not mathematically doing it. But when I say mathematically, that was just a misstatement. I apologize. But, we have to control. That was what I was the word I was looking for. We have to control for in clinical trials, such as the sort of, the best that we know of, the double-blind, placebo-controlled research trial, because it can account up for 30% of the treatment effect, and that's a lot. That's the sugar water idea. It's just or the sugar pill idea. You give somebody a sugar pill, and just the idea that it's doing something is making them get better. And so that's just, to me, telling me that consciousness has this control over physiological processes, like repair processes that we don't even really fundamentally understand. It has a tie into the immune system that we don't understand, or at least the regenerative systems, whether it's the the mesenchymal, however you want to say it, regions of the body. But yeah, that'll be a conversation for another time, I think. So yeah, fear of death, don't let it get you down, because meditating on it too much can create pathological triggers and cause feedback loops of projection. But yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's helpful. Okay, signing off.